Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, a production of WDIW Media, hosted by Joseph Pazar and inspired by David Michael Slater's book, We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them. Before I bring you today's conversation, we have a few updates to share. There are several ways you can contact the podcast, all of which are outlined on the site, we'redoingitwrong.com/podcast. First, we've added a Call the Pod feature on the site. You can call the podcast to respond to something you hear, especially if you disagree, to provide a quick outline of a topic you'd like to share on the show, or just to ask a question. Over time, we can gather your questions and produce a special episode with answers. The phone line we set up will not be answered live, but will record your responses. At the beginning of your message, be sure to include permission for us to use your audio on the show. This will be a fun way for us to remain connected with you. We can't promise we'll be able to respond to every message, depending on the level of response, but we'll definitely give it a try. Finally, we have set up a Patreon account specifically for this podcast. We've included that link in our episode descriptions. This feature allows a prospective supporter to pledge a specified dollar amount per episode and allows you to set a monthly maximum. This way you can't inadvertently provide more support than you intend, even for a podcaster who decides to produce extra episodes. Anyways, if you're inclined to support us, such support will help us reach more people with the show and help us cover just some basic operating expenses. However, this is not the most important type of support that you can provide us. Every time you review the show or share an episode, or even send us recommendations for guests, it helps more than you know. And ultimately, your listenership is the most important thing to us. We really appreciate it. Okay, today I bring you a conversation with Dr. Greg Smith. Dr. Smith is Emeritus Professor of the Lewis and Clark Graduate School of Education and Counseling. He has written extensively on the subject of community and place-based education over several decades, and has focused on ways educators can contribute to the regeneration of social and biotic communities. It was quite a pleasure to speak with Dr. Smith, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. So without further ado, I bring you Professor Smith. And I'm here with Dr. Greg Smith. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I wanted to just start off with a brief sketch of your work. We're going to talk about place-based education today. Can you give our audience kind of the short outline of your life as it pertains to education?
Sure. I started teaching high school English back in the late 1970s at Ashland High School in Southern Oregon. And then taught for 6 years, taught there for 2 years, and then taught for 6 years at a small Quaker boarding school in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California that really had a profound impact on my sense of the possibilities of education, in part because of the way that the experience that students had there really drew them into a strong sense of community and community responsibility. The school is located on 300 acres. Students are responsible for a wide variety of work jobs that they did with staff, and much of our work was really informed by Quaker concerns about social justice and peace issues. And so what happened was that students who had never really kind of thought that it was possible to live within the context of community really were energized by this and developed a much deeper sense of their own capability of making a difference to the welfare of others. And my wife and I taught there for 6 years. And after we left, I realized I wanted to figure out how to bring that kind of experience to more students in public schools. And so ended up going back to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and worked on a PhD that was really focused on strengthening the relationship between schools and communities. And that has really informed much of my work since that time. I taught for a couple of years at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then for 23 years at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, where I was able to teach classes that kind of touched upon these issues and focused on issues tied into the relationship between education and the creation of more sustainable culture, where I think place-based education really can play a role. So that kind of briefly is kind of an overview of my career. Since I retired a couple of years ago, I've been serving on the board of a small school that does a lot of place-based education, as well as on the educational advisory committee for the Teton Science Schools, which is making place-based education a centerpiece of its work, as well as continuing to serve as a fellow for the National Educational Policy Center, where I'm doing podcasts myself with educational researchers around the country who are doing progressive work that really is aimed at creating more equitable schools.
I didn't realize you had taught at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I actually grew up in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula and went to
Really?
University of Alaska Anchorage. So it's
Uh-huh.
it's a state that really lends itself to this place-based education. I know I started my career up there, and I taught 2 years of sixth grade, and we did water monitoring for a stream that really ran just behind the school. So it's kind of a neat thing to
Yeah.
start teaching in that environment. Well, let's launch into it. I think people long for connection within their communities and to feel as though their communities matter and aren't on some sort of fatal trajectory of decline, especially some of the smaller communities across the nation. And a pervasive feeling of isolation, might be growing among people, at least in my view, and may even be partly responsible for what we see in our politics, growing tribalism. It seems to permeate every aspect of our political lives. So I'm wondering if you can talk about place-based education in this context while giving our listeners a basic definitional sense of what it is. And please feel free to disagree with the premise of the question as well. So how is place-based education functioning to connect students to their communities? And do you think that's more important now than it's ever been?
I think that place-based education is primarily aimed at trying to establish that sense of connection between students and the places where they live, both the social and the natural environments that surround them. And I think my primary reason for getting into place-based education is a sense that for large numbers of people growing up in the society, alienation and disconnection are really kind of contributing factors to their own sense of depression, their own sense of powerlessness, and their sense of anger that the society is really not delivering to them in the ways that people need societies to deliver them. And so I think that place-based education really seeks to kind of break down the barrier that exists between classrooms and communities that has kind of been part of the whole educational scene since the creation of public education. And I kind of agree with John Dewey, who felt that it was really critical that some institution draw students both into a sense of their membership in small communities where they live, as well as a membership in the greater national community as well. And I think that place-based education really seeks to kind of achieve this end by, bringing students out into the community to give them an opportunity to see what's happening there, giving them opportunities to actually engage with adults in the solution of local problems, as well as giving them an opportunity to spend time in the natural world, to give them experiences that are becoming increasingly rare as it's harder for kids to kind of play on their own outside in the neighborhoods that surround their homes, as well as the fear that parents have about having kids be as independent and free roaming as they were when I grew up. And so place-based education is really by seeking to create these opportunities that bridge classrooms to communities and places to help students really begin to see themselves as members of this kind of broader community of human beings, but ideally a broader community of all beings, so that they come out of that experience with a sense of responsibility for the welfare of their own social environment, but also a sense of caring and a sense of concern and a willingness to take action to preserve the integrity of the natural environment that surrounds them as well. So by creating opportunities for students to learn in the community, interact with adults in that community, and really get a sense of like where it is that they are, I think the hope is that those kinds of experiences will lead to the creation of adults who are more willing to be actively involved in the political and civic life of their own community in ways that are really aimed at benefiting everyone and not only the members of certain groups.
Is there any meaningful difference between applications in urban versus rural areas, or is just maybe some of the mechanisms different, but everything, all the core ideas are the same?
I think the core ideas are pretty similar. Place-based education really kind of arose primarily in rural communities to begin with. There was an effort in the 1990s to try to strengthen the relationship between schools and communities by an organization called the Annenberg World Challenge. And the challenge kind of devoted $50 million to work in around 20 different communities around the United States to really help schools and communities get better together. And in doing so, they really kind of sought to help children in rural communities kind of recognize the value and the benefits and strengths of those of their communities. Because so oftentimes in schools, the focus is so much on urban life and industrialism that rural schools oftentimes disregard the nature of their own communities and the benefits of those communities. And so the Annenberg World Challenge really kind of sought to kind of help kids see the value of those communities. I would say that much the same thing happens in especially inner city urban environments, where kids are kind of positioned to kind of escape their own neighborhoods thanks to education, rather than digging in and really making those places better. And so in urban environments, I think there's a similar kind of emphasis on finding local experts and finding local issues to deal with, getting kids out into the community. The focus might be less on kind of natural environmental issues and more on social environmental issues. But even in urban environments, there are oftentimes plenty of parks and other places where kids can explore natural environmental issues as well.
Just getting at that basic definition again, where would you place place-based education in relation to project-based learning? Is it possible to have quality place-based education that isn't synonymous to some form of, the Buck Institute sense of PBL, or does place-based education fit under the umbrella of project-based learning?
I would say that project-based learning, if it focuses on genuine issues within the context of students' own environments, gains a higher level of power and significance, because students feel as though the work that they're doing actually has value beyond the classroom and beyond the project. So I would say that, yeah, place-based education can be a form of project-based learning, but that project-based learning is chances are going to be more meaningful if it actually is grounded in students' lives. So I very much appreciate the work of the Buck Institute, and I think they've done kind of an incredible service in spelling out in many more specific ways the kinds of thoughts and kind of schemas that teachers can keep in mind when doing effective project-based work. And I think the only thing I would add to it is just that by, again, focusing on the local, the project-based learning will be more meaningful. I would say that all place-based education is not necessarily project-based. I think it's possible to have place-based education that is kind of looking at local literature, for example, that's written within a particular region without necessarily having to be tied to specific projects that are enacted out in the community. I would say that the study of local history doesn't necessarily have to involve projects. The study of local biology in terms of local plants and animals doesn't necessarily have to involve projects. So I'd say that place-based education encompasses a broader range of kind of instructional delivery systems beyond project-based learning.
I want to transition to this idea of academic rigor, but before I do that, or to do that, I want to read a little bit of a long quote that you use in an article you published for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education. And it's a John Dewey quote, of course, so it has to be read. He writes, "From the standpoint of the child, the great waste in a school comes from his inability to utilize the experiences he gets outside the school in any complete and free way within the school itself, while on the other hand, he is unable to apply in daily life what he is learning at school. This is the isolation of the school. It's isolation from life. When the child gets into the schoolroom, he has to put out of his mind a large part of the ideas, interests, and activities that predominate in his home and neighborhood. So, the school being unable to utilize this everyday experience sets painfully to work on another tack, and by a variety of means to arouse in the child an interest in school studies." When I came across that quote within the context of your article, I couldn't help but immediately think of math, probably because I'm a math teacher, but also because I think, and I have this sense that that's a hard thing to approach with place-based learning. So in the Common Core definition of rigor, they cite conceptual understanding, fluency, and application. And that application piece is difficult with certain math topics because, regardless of a teacher's best efforts, it's often still very contrived. Word problem just doesn't cut it for a real application. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this idea of more broadly academic rigor. Can we be highly academically rigorous with place-based education? And then if that's true, if we can, does math often take a backseat to the other subjects?
I would say that the question of rigor is a tricky one, in part because the whole notion of rigor kind of connotes a kind of narrowness and a tightness in terms of the standards that are being used to assess the quality of student learning. And for me, I think the more important issue is the degree to which students are deeply engaged in what it is that they're doing. And if students feel as though what they're doing is in fact meaningful and valuable to others, they will oftentimes commit themselves to those activities with a degree of persistence and determination and kind of exactitude that I think contributes to the creation of products which are viewed as high quality. And so I think I would be more inclined to talk about high quality and value than rigor as a means for thinking about what it is that we're hoping will happen. And thinking about like science investigations in terms of historical investigations, the kinds of writing that students will do for publications that are then distributed to a broader audience. I think when students feel as though the work that they are doing is actually contributing in some way to the public processes of their own community, and will get a kind of a broader audience than what normally happens in terms of assignments only going to teachers, then they end up investing a lot more time and energy and attention to those kinds of activities. And so I think what can see, like, if students have the opportunity, as students, for example, at a school in Portland that I'm associated with, to participate in an archaeology roadshow that is held at Portland State University every year. Kids there have done presentations about the, I think last year They looked at the creation of a longhouse model based upon their investigation of the Clatsop people in our region, and the Chinookian people in our region. And so we're the only third graders, actually the only K-12 students who were at this particular event. And they do really high quality work when that happens to be the outcome of what their assignments are. And I think that place-based education really fits in well with a lot of science in the community type activities, with biological investigations, environmental investigations, and historical, etc. Math is somewhat more difficult, in part because not all of the topics in math, particularly as math becomes more advanced, are necessarily kind of tied into easy forms of application. I would say that with regard to statistics, with regard to geometry, with regard to the creation of graphs, et cetera, place-based education can provide like a multiplicity of opportunities for data collection and data summaries, et cetera. With regard to some of the issues tied into more advanced algebra and calculus, where the applications are really kind of linked into physics and chemistry and engineering, I would say that those kinds of applications really need to be kind of grounded within the context of the science classes themselves in which that math is actively used. Unfortunately, that oftentimes doesn't happen. And I think what happens then is, for a lot of students, the kind of college algebra that they take in high school and calculus becomes so abstract that it's very difficult to see what meaning it necessarily has then later in their lives outside the context of those classes. So I think if there were actually more integration between calculus and college algebra classes and the chemistry and physics classes that students are also taking, and there really was an effort to kind of link those classes to specific kinds of issues that are of significance to those communities. And I think that there really could be value there. I know of one example in a pre-calculus class where students were asked to use their kind of emerging understanding of trigonometry to take the measurement of all of the buildings on the tsunami plain in a coastal community in Oregon. And they had been asked to do this by the planning department because emergency planners just didn't have the person power to be able to go out and do all of this work. So these students, kind of using their understanding of trigonometry, were able to actually come up with the dimensions of those buildings, provide the information to the city planners and the emergency planners, and then they were able to use the software to model the impact of tidal waves of different sizes on the community. It's one of the rare examples that I have where folks in a pre-calculus class could actually do that. But I think that more imagination kind of turned to that particular issue on the part of science and math teachers could potentially lead to a much broader range of possibilities that could be very enticing for students, as well as also valuable in terms of kind of grounding their understanding in those opportunities to actually apply what oftentimes in math classes remains so abstract that it never really becomes deeply embedded in people's consciousness and their intellects.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think every chance we get from the math perspective to apply in an authentic way, it causes the concept to stick so wonderfully. It's worth all the time invested. I can think of just one example, and while you were speaking, just, I couldn't help but thinking, okay, as math teachers and science teachers, we've got some homework to do. If students are looking at the density level of a particular weed in a local field, the concept of area then becomes very real, right? They're taking some square area, counting some item, then, multiplying that out for the larger area. And I do think it's those little opportunities that can make math so much more deeply understood by students. But it's interesting that you say it really is difficult. I did kind of sense that it's a little bit more difficult to integrate in some of the ways the other subjects aren't difficult to integrate in something like place-based education. But from this concept of, and you use the phrases like meaningfulness rather than rigor to high level meaningfulness, or how did you phrase that again? It was, instead of rigor, you cited what?
Well, high quality and meaningful. When students basically feel as though they have the opportunity to share what they're doing with others, and that work genuinely has value, then they're willing to invest themselves in it. And that investment isn't purely because of either a sense of competitiveness, of fear, or kind of the desire to be better than others.
And that made me think of something you cite again in your paper, Sobel's Four Principles, because when I read through them, they seem like they're very high level transitions in, or new directions as he calls them. So I'll just read them out, and feel free to comment, at will. But I think it'd be valuable to myself and our listeners to kind of hear your thoughts on these ideas. So these new directions that place-based education can occur. So one, from extraction to sustainability as the underlying metaphor. Two, from fragmentation to systems thinking as a conceptual model. And three, from here and now to long ago and far away as a developmental guideline for curriculum design. And four, from mandated monoculture to emergent diversity as a school district goal. And I know there's just a ton there, so unpack, what you want, of course, for us. But those things strike me as being extremely high level intellectually for our students to explore.
It's interesting to hear these again from David, because they actually came from a chapter in a book that I did on ecological education by a guy named Paul Crefel, who's a natural history educator and school principal down in Northern California. But Paul basically kind of laid out all of those things, with the exception of the here and now. But I would say that what I like about David's vision here, and Paul's as well, is the way in which it really takes learning beyond like a focus on discrete information and facts to the development of a more systemic kind of approach to life and to the world, so that there's really an effort to kind of look beyond just the specifics of what we're doing, but understand the nature of the interdependence that we share with all other people and all other beings and the planet as a whole. And that in terms of moving like from extraction to sustainability, it really seems critical that we look at the worldview that has led us, in part thanks to folks like Francis Bacon and Descartes, to really parse everything up into such small pieces in order to control them, that we don't really grasp the consequences of our actions in a much broader level. And I think that much of what this kind of vision, kind of moving into systemic thinking and to kind of looking at the complexity of things tied into this kind of vision of diversity, it becomes possible for people to develop a broader perspective that could potentially and hopefully lead a culture that is, I think in many respects, facing a very serious political and social and environmental dead end, to begin to imagine how we could reconceptualize our life on this small, delicate planet in ways that will allow us to actually contribute to its regeneration rather than its destruction. And I think we have a very serious set of tasks that lie before us, and certainly in the coming generations, to really figure out how to clean up the mess that has really kind of arisen from the last 500 years, and a way of understanding that really has broken things up into little pieces and has failed to look at things systemically, and has focused more on extraction and the benefit of the few than the welfare of the many.
Yeah, Carl Sagan's pale blue dot really does put things in perspective a bit, huh?
Yeah.
Just to follow up on the fourth point. So again, it's from mandated monoculture to emergent diversity as a school district goal. I'm wondering if you feel as though place-based education is kind of a perfectly designed vehicle to get beyond the predominant culture and expose students to to other ideas that do and other cultures that reside in the community. And if that's true, which it seems a bit obvious to me that probably is true, what are the various ways teachers can do that? Because before in the conversation you mentioned, exploring a specific genre of literature that might be locally tied. And I had always thought of place-based education as being maybe a broader, more difficult endeavor. So could you talk about, how to expose our students to different cultures through place-based education, but also within the context of maybe like a starting point for a teacher who's never even approached this before and maybe wants to start small?
Sure. Again, I'm thinking of like the school in Portland that I've been working with, and a way that a sixth grade teacher has been exploring issues tied into diversity in Portland, which is a pretty white community, and she has, with her sixth graders, for the past few years, done an investigation of the civil rights movement in Portland. And they've gone out to central locations of what happened during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and have met with people who were leaders of that effort. And they have then put together, films and kind of graphic comic books summarizing the kinds of things that they've learned. But there really has been an effort to go out and meet this diverse range of people. Another classroom, another grade, looked at the history of the treatment of the Japanese during World War II in Portland, and went out and visited the Japanese museum that kind of explores this issue, and were really curious about like the way in which they had been kept at an exposition center that was kind of turned into just a series of very small compartments for people. And so they ended up making a model of that three-dimensional model of that facility that is now part of the museum. The students look very extensively at the experience of Native Americans in this region. And so there really is an effort to look at the cultural backgrounds of a much broader range of people than normally kind of enter into both language arts studies and historical studies. And so if there's an effort to bring in like this range of different people to the classroom, that's an important step. But even more important is creating opportunities where students will be in classes with a broad range of different people as well, whose lives and experiences in the community are made the basis for some of the explorations that the students engage in as well. But I think that in a community that might be more monocultural, really kind of taking, like many of the suburban communities in Portland are much more white, giving those students an opportunity to interact with students in other schools that have very different experiences can be valuable, and trying to kind of cross some of the boundaries that exist between communities and regions as a means for attempting to help deepen students' understanding of the kind of the range of people who are out there. I think the other thing that can happen is that when students kind of investigate issues within the context of their own communities, they're encouraged to investigate similar issues in the context of other communities, and forming collaborative relationships either between schools who are working on similar kinds of kind of locally based projects, and then sharing information across those schools, or sometimes even doing exchanges of one sort or another. There was a really extraordinary after school and summer program that existed in program for a number of years called the Gaia Project, that worked primarily with kids in low-income neighborhoods in Portland. And they would look at a topic like homelessness in Portland. And then during the summer, thanks to the ability of the founders of this program to find some decent funding, would take the kids to either Ecuador or Thailand, where they'd have an opportunity to look at the same issue there. And then when they would come back to Portland, they were then required to spend the next year sharing what they had learned with other audiences in the Portland region. So it was really a rich kind of sharing across these cultural differences, but looking at how people are dealing with similar kinds of issues that are really worth serious investigation within the context of their own community.
Yeah, I don't know if it gets much better than that. That would be a pretty amazing experience, I can imagine, for a student to look at the same issue in, two vastly different areas of the world. I'm wondering about this kind of sense of, I sense that this is a high quality approach to teaching. And in my own experience, very few people start out as rock stars in the profession. It takes time to get good at teaching. And to do something like place-based education requires, building community connections, partnerships, different ways to get your students civically engaged, and maybe a bit of, bravery to try something new. And from that, I think, okay, well, then it takes some people who have been in the profession for a while. This is something that you build upon. This is not a curriculum book that you open and then jump into and read the script from. So I'm wondering, from your position as a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Counseling, if you've got a sense of how we're doing with the sustainability of teachers as individuals remaining in the profession, and if this thing that's popularly referred to as the coming, or it's already here, teacher shortage is as bad as some make it sound. But basically, what to summarize my question is the turnover of teachers, and what's often cited as the 50% leave before year 5 or something like that, is that a huge impediment to this sort of high quality learning?
I think that teachers can actually begin to learn how to do this stuff pretty quickly, is what I'm seeing, if they are in schools where they are surrounded by other teachers who are doing similar work, or if there is a person who kind of acts as a place-based education coordinator. And when that happens, then I think beginning teachers, particularly if they start small, are given an opportunity to kind of develop some sea legs for this kind of work, and are given the assistance of someone who is able to kind of make those initial contacts with folks out in the community. Even younger teachers, kind of new to the field, can begin to do this work with some level of expertise. Um, so, so I think a lot of it depends upon context. A lot of it also depends upon the willingness of teachers, as you say, to take risks and trust their students. A lot of place-based education is really contingent upon the willingness of teachers to turn over authority and responsibility to kids. And when that begins to happen, then the kids almost always rise to the occasion. With regard to the issue of teacher turnover, which I think really is a critical issue. And I think in many respects, the standards and accountability movement has contributed to that, as well as the way in which teachers, in part tied into the standards and accountability movement, have been given less and less respect by the society as a whole. That weighs heavily on a lot of people. We've been holding for the last few years a place-based education jamboree to bring together teachers and administrators from about a dozen schools in Oregon that are doing place-based education now. And one of the things that has really struck me by spending time with these teachers is the kind of energy and excitement they feel about their work. And I think part of that is tied into the way in which they're given real respect and authority and the opportunity to really be creative and to do work that is meaningful for themselves in schools that allow them to kind of branch out into the community and pursue possibilities that not only give their students recognition in terms of their ability to make contributions to the broader community, but also give teachers that kind of recognition and value them. And so I think place-based education, when well implemented, can allow teachers to really develop the same sense of being involved in meaningful activities, of being valued, that can motivate children. At the same time, I think it's important to realize that not everything needs to be place-based. Place-based is something that can be reserved for some kind of central and important activities over the course of the year. But if teachers are expected to make everything tied into the community, you're going to burn them out and they're going to become exhausted. They may have that kind of energy for a while, but it's not the sort of thing that can be seen as a magic kind of a silver bullet for solving all educational problems. I think it's part of a vision that is kind of tied into giving people opportunities to connect to where they are in terms of their own education. It gives them an opportunity to be creative and make meaningful contributions, collaborate with others, and really feel as though they have a voice within the context of their community. If that can happen for both teachers and students, then I think that the longevity turnover problem is not going to be as serious, and that also we're going to see a much higher level of engagement and participation on the part of students.
So you've already addressed this in part, so, but I'm wondering if you can comment just a bit more on what district administrators and even school administrators, principals, can do maybe from a structural perspective to make this maybe a bit easier to embed in the culture of a school and to make it more sustainable among staff. What are some of the structural things that leaders can do?
I would say like one of the first things to do is create an environment of trust at your school in which teachers are seen truly as professionals who are committed to doing good work, and trusting students as well, and being willing to kind of run interference with parents or other members of the community who might initially question what it is that you're doing. So I think principals and superintendents really play a very critical role in kind of interpreting these kinds of changes. They can also play a really critical role in the creation of the kinds of partnerships that really need to be established for place-based education to work effectively. If they can let businesses and agency heads, other supporters of the school, artists in the community, recognize that they have a critical role to play in the education of the community's children, then I think that there's going to be a greater likelihood that teachers, when they reach out to those community members, will be able to, in fact, find those willing partners and allies. There's a retired educator in Seaside, coastal community, that actually, where students did the work with regard to determining the measurement of buildings on the tsunami plain. Neil had developed memoranda of agreements between the school district and the city and county governments that required the city and the county, when they had research projects that could be accomplished by students in the district schools, they were required to seek out teachers who would be able to work with their students to actually do those research projects. Memorandum of agreement like that could make a huge difference in helping a whole community begin to see ways in which the school is an intellectual resource for the community as a whole, rather than a drain on the community's resources. And so the establishment of that kind of back and forth is something that administrators could basically play a major role in advancing. So I think administrators are really kind of critical to this entire effort. I would say really exploring the way in which school schedules and calendars could be changed to be able to kind of allow for more of this kind of work outside the classroom. Experimenting with ways that transportation budgets can be modified to allow students to both kind of get outside the classroom and into the neighborhood around their school, but potentially go to other areas as well. And then really rethinking how it is that student work is really being evaluated. Rather than being so dependent upon standardized tests, develop assessment processes that really engage the community as a whole, where community members are coming in and judging the quality of student work that has value for the community. So I think that That sort of thing would really benefit significantly from the support of administrators. Administrators could also support positions like a place-based education coordinator or a field studies coordinator, a garden coordinator. So really looking at how the sorts of learning experiences that really support learning in ways that kind of go beyond the restrictions of the classroom could go a long way to helping this become more widespread, in the same way that computer teachers and people who basically oversaw computer labs in schools became integrated into schools. The same thing could happen with learning experiences that are situated beyond the classroom.
I sort of stuck on one of the phrases you used. I think you said something like schools can become an intellectual resource to a community rather than a drain on that community. I find that not only to be a paradigm shift, but absolutely inspirational. And I think that might be a great way to bring this to a conclusion, because I'm mindful of your time now. We're approaching just over 15 minutes here, but anything else you want to let us know about place-based education before we wrap this up?
I think that the main thing that I'd like to share is just the value of shifting a perspective about where teaching and learning can happen, and recognizing that communities are these extraordinary resources that could be tapped in ways that could deepen students' learning experiences, teachers' experiences as instructors, as well as making a significant contribution to the welfare and life of the community as a whole. And that the best place to start is like in a school ground or in the neighborhood around the school. Start small and let it evolve in the same way that a seed grows. Rather than expecting things to be full-blown quickly and to be implemented in a way that is kind of totally faithful to some kind of vision, I think oftentimes inhibits these kinds of changes. And so I would encourage people to start small, learn from their own experiences, and go at it with a real sense of goodwill and trust and love for the people in one's own community.
So if a teacher or administrator or just anyone is interested in getting started, where would you direct them? And in any of the references you make that are online, I'll go ahead and put in our episode description. So where could they go to find out more about you and your work and place-based in general?
I think if they just kind of Google Gregory Smith place-based education, a number of the things that I've written will come up. David Sobel, who is recently retired from Antioch, New England, has done extensive work. So looking at his publications, David Greenwood at Lakewood University in Canada has done a lot of work in this area. There's a new book by one of the educators at the school in Portland that I mentioned called Bringing Schools to Life. Her name is Sarah Anderson, and I would strongly recommend that people look at that book. There's a woman named Amy Demarest, who is an educator in Vermont, has also written about place-based education in ways that I think are very powerful. The Teton Science School is beginning to develop materials for professional development around these issues. So they're worth checking out. The Great Lakes Stewardship Initiative in Michigan has done extraordinary work for over a decade, really attempting to develop citizen stewards among the students in that state. There's a nice set of podcasts that were done with 4 of us who were involved in place-based education last spring on Lab Out Loud, it's Lab Out Loud, which is a National Science Teachers Association sponsored podcast. And so I think those would give people a starting point. Also, the Community Works Institute in New England has also done work around place-based education for the past couple of decades, and they would be another good source of information. And then the books that David Sobel and David Greenwood and I have done would give folks a kind of an introductory overview too.
Wonderful, and I'll put as many links as I can find that seem reasonable in terms of length in our episode description. I cannot thank you enough. You're an amazing resource and an inspiration to me, and I'm sure to many who hear you. I feel energized. Like, okay, this is something that I definitely want to dive deeper into. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure again, Joe. It's been nice chatting with you, and appreciated the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, you can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitwrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.